We have to really push ourselves to believe these coexist harmoniously. Because if we do that and we lead as entrepreneurs, the funding follows, the people follow, and the outcomes will be there. We need to stop thinking of life as a green premium and more as a green discount. Like, good business is essentially good for the brand, good for the supply chain, and really good for the planet. Welcome to Shiko. Thank you for having me. Absolutely. Very excited for this conversation that we're going to have. Could you share a bit more about yourself? My name is Malini. I'm based here in Singapore. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Noel. I've been in tech for about 10 years, but more recently, sort of as of early part of this year, I decided to go on this journey to start like a fashion tech company that's also using the best of agentic AI to solve really meaningful problems. And so that's what's brought me, I think, onto your conversation today as well. That's great. So you said fashion, agentic AI, and a lot of the things that we're hearing at this point in terms of like AI evolution, agentic models, and everything. What is it that you're building at Knoll? And I would also like to know that how is it different from what other fashion and textile companies are doing when they talk about sustainability? Yeah. So sustainability is a really big field, right? And then like in the world of fashion, when you think about a brand, there's a lot of different elements of what it means to be sustainable. But we as a tech company, we serve small and medium fashion brands. The fundamental problem that we're trying to address is overproduction, which basically means that brands typically produce 10 items and then only end up selling 4 or 5 of them. And that happens across the variety of brands, not just small, medium brands, even large brands. You often find these like stories about how there's like so much unsold inventory and then it had to be like marked down and finally it had to be liquidated and dumped. And so there's this problem occurs for so many different reasons. But when it comes to small and medium brands, one of the reasons it occurs is because often fashion operations is very complicated. Trying to figure out what will sell, how much of it will sell, where it will sell, and then trying to plan your production in a system that was designed for very large scale manufacturing, but you as a small brand are trying to somehow fit into it. It's very difficult. And so that's how we're sort of thinking about who we serve. We work with these small and medium brands that essentially agentic AI can give them like a team overnight, right? So they're still like at the front and center of the very human and creative part of fashion, which is designing the products that they believe will work, connecting with their audiences and building what they think is a brand that they want to stand by. But we help them do sort of all of the planning, forecasting, inventory management, the upstream materials management with this idea that let's just make something that is more closely aligned to what will sell, both in quantity and in format of what that is. Thank you for sharing, Malini. That was very interesting. I want to know what was that reflection point? That's something you mentioned that how companies produce, discard. What was that reflection point that made you realize that this is the kind of problem that you want to tackle? That's a great question. Actually, one of our early investors and sort of our first backers is VC here in Southeast Asia. And when I was about to join them, they have this climate tech, almost like an accelerator, if you will, or a venture studio, I should call it. And they're very open to entrepreneurs coming in, not necessarily with any specific problem in mind. And so I had this sort of freedom to choose, right? And but this is the problem I chose. And all of it came back to like I was living in London and I was going to move back to Singapore to join this venture studio. And what is the one thing you do when you're like packing up your house? You have all these clothes and you think about, I'm not going to need this anymore. And I had this like amazing little clothing recycle bin right under my house. And so I found myself over a period of time, which is like, I think the 2, 3 weeks that you're putting things in boxes and thinking about what to ship, what not to ship. I found myself visiting that bin like almost 10 times, right? Everything from like clothes and because it was so easy. It was so easy to think that I was doing the right thing because there was a bin right there and I'd bring my stuff and I put it in there. And finally, because I knew I was going to come into this venture studio and I was starting to become really intentional about things I was doing. So everything at home, felt like, where does this go? What happens to it? So I had this, and so I started to think about where do these clothes go from this recycle bin, right? And that led me on this, I think, sort of really crazy internet search to realize that you think you're donating your clothes, but what is happening is they're getting dumped all across the global south. And so when I first sort of joined the venture studio, so a couple of weeks later, I moved back to Singapore, started right away in this venture studio. And I start to speak to recyclers, and I start to trace like these really large unseen markets, not just of like clothes that you and I are discarding, but actually of clothes that have been like overproduced that never got sold. And I think that problem really stuck with me. It stuck with me that it's one thing to say we are creating a very linear design for apparel. And so essentially a lot of the clothes that we have today, there's no value for resale. Some of it does, but most of it doesn't. And it's built for like short term use. But it's a whole other thing to say, just because we're so optimistic about how much we think we will sell as well, like 150 billion garments got produced this year. Isn't that crazy, just as a number? Because we're so optimistic about it, we're going to produce this. And then, oops, if no one buys it, we're just going to end up, giving it to a recycler. They're going to try to sell it in the global south because, that's where apparently everything we don't want will go to. And then if they can't, they'll just dump it, right? They'll sell it to a recycler, wash up on a beach somewhere. Someone will have to make something out of it. And so I think that whole idea just didn't sit well with me. It felt like there must be a better way to align like profit and planet. And this particular problem, which is why produce something you are likely never to sell, felt like the kind of the exact argument for this is no longer asking for a green premium. This is actually a green discount because it's good for the business and it's good for the planet if we don't use resources that are never going to have a good outcome. So, yeah.
Based on my understanding, it also feels like that you're also trying to resolve the land. I want to understand how is it that you're trying to bring technology and conscious design to ensure that you're solving this problem when you're speaking with some of these fashion brands?
Yeah, they're going, sort of large parts of. I think there's a beach in Ghana where they wash up, and it's sort of visually just so it's so challenging that is what has happened. And then parts of India, as you know, and I know we're familiar with, which are just these like large recycling markets. So I think this is like a systemic problem, right? And I think also solving such a large scale problem is actually like unwinding the way that an industry has been constructed. Because if you think about it, all of this is like we talked about linear design earlier, right? And now you've designed a system of production, distribution, and sales where fashion brands were almost expected to like guess or take a bet on what's going to happen in a market. And now they're like unwinding this back to go, well, it's taking me X number of months to produce that. So I'm going to take a bet on design. I'm going to take a bet on quantity, and then I'm going to work backwards to like figure out how to deliver this, right? And so there's multiple ways you could look at that kind of linear design that is and ask yourself, why does this happen? Why does that happen? And a lot of different models have emerged that have tried to also kind of turn this around. So I think that's one of the sort of systemic issues that we deal with. So when you now think about like how do you apply tech to this, right? My goal here is to make sure that nothing ends up in landfill in the first place. So there are multiple parts of this. The first part is let's not produce stuff that won't sell, right? But there's also other parts. I mean, I think you were really looking into circularity in a big way. So there's what happens once you sell it, and then, how do you make sure that you can perfectly repurpose it back into the next garment. And so there's this lots of parts across this value chain that need re-examining, right from designing for circularity of an apparel, so the materials that we use, right down to like systems and processes which have the right incentives, which is be rewarded for accuracy of production rather than overproduction, and maximizing sales, all the way down to like whether something can be repurposed sort of within apparel or have a home in the next adjacent industry, like be used as filler material for couches or insulation or whatever that purpose is. Like, how do we extend the life of materials, right? The way we are using agentic AI today is very simple. Like 80% of brands by number, because when I say fashion brands, I think the immediate like image that all of us get is like these really large multinational brands that exist in multiple markets. But today in the industry, 80% brands by number are SME brands. And they're not equipped. Like there's no specific systems designed for them. A large part of their world exists on Excel. And they're kind of trying to balance everything from being a great business owner to a brand builder to a great designer along with operations. And as a result, operations is like, I think it's not something they over index on. You may find a couple of brands doing really good at that, but most of them, they have to focus on these other sort of more external facets of their business. And so that's where tech can be a great enabler because fashion is a very complex category. Like there's style, color, size, location. There's so many dimensions to knowing what to place where. What is the likelihood that it will sell if you create more of it? And how do you make sure that you can convert your cash that you essentially sitting as inventory back into something that's more meaningful? And so that's one way that we are doing it. It's to make sure that in the first place, like things don't have to go to landfill. Of course, there's like a huge opportunity to collaborate within this industry, which is something that we always have at the back of our mind. I mean, we're a young startup, but we're always thinking like in the future, how do we kind of extend this platform to make sure that both sort of on conscious design, that's the upstream portion of this, as well as downstream with like giving optionality to consumers to what to do with what they've purchased. Like how does the life of our platform extend to provide these fashion brands with ways to interconnect with other solutions that are coming up in this space? And I think that's what's needed too. Like has to be collaborative. I'll just like say a couple of words about like why agentic AI, right? And why now? At the core of it, there is like, we know that fashion is a very trend driven business. Even staples, which are like things that you can largely take for granted, like a white t shirt or shorts, but it kind of moves in waves in terms of the quantity and the sizes and whether it's oversized or current sized but that also means that it's cyclical, right? So it moves over years, but it's likely to come back as well. And so if you think about how like brands run by people, maybe someone leaves the company. Maybe they had perfect intelligence on something that they created that worked well, but then for a while that SKU was no longer relevant or that particular sort of product was no longer relevant. But 5 years later, there's a resurgence, right? So the idea of building intelligence at an SKU level, which is what we're doing, is that when things come back, so when a style of boots comes back 10 years later, you already have at your fingertips, like, what was the performance of this the last time I did this? What worked and what didn't work, right? And then you have this ability to make more informed decisions compared to what has traditionally been perhaps a more gut driven industry. And nothing wrong with that. Like, AI is here to daily enable human creativity, right? At least that's the way we have perceived the role of our solution. It is to help to give data to that gut decision. And so that's how we think about how agentic AI can play a role. And today, building in today's world, like that is the type of tech stack that is available to us. And it can sort of fundamentally transform what having data-based decisions means for small brand owners.
Very interesting. So we spoke about the social element in terms of what Nool is trying to solve, the landfill aspect. We also spoke about the intelligence part where there is enough like historical data for designers to go back and look what worked and how do they iterate and move forward. Could you share some data points in terms of how is it economically the brands have benefited by using Nool?
Absolutely. I think it's actually like really costly for a brand to overproduce, right? If you think about it, they may not perceive all these costs all at once because of the fundamental way in which like fashion production happens. So let me give an example. Maybe a t-shirt produced by a manufacturer, for a brand that costs about like $5, let's say, right? But they are able to sell this t-shirt for, let's say, $50 in the market that they're operating in. So it feels logical that like you should overproduce, right? Because the missed opportunity of not having that t-shirt in that color or that style at the place when someone wants to buy it, And this is like compounded by retail, because in e-com, you could also say like, maybe they have the time to produce it, right? But compounded by retail, because you walk into that shop, if that t-shirt is not there in that color, that's a missed opportunity, right? So for a long time, because of this, there was this idea that, maybe let's just incentivize overproduction to a degree. Maybe I put it the other way. Underproduction is penalized. The natural tendency is towards overproduction. But when you think about, what that means in terms of actual cost to brand, one, they've locked up whatever capital they had for that buying cycle in potentially wrong inventory. Like some of it is in wrong inventory. Secondly, they have like warehousing costs. And thirdly, and I think this is kind of like more fundamental, like even this idea that that t-shirt cost them $5 is because they haven't like factored the true cost of what it costs to create that t-shirt, right? So there's like all these elements which are, I think there's a strong sort of thesis in sustainability around like the true nature-based cost of something. And that's not factored in. Like it's just like the cheapest way to get something done is how they think about it, but it's not the fully loaded cost of all the inputs or the even sort of, this is an industry that's mired in like labor challenges. So it doesn't sort of necessarily is not the true cost of labor that is accounted for as well, right? So over time, that has gotten more expensive from a narrative perspective, right? So when someone says like brands are not sustainable, or when a brand is claiming sustainability, like these are kind of the levers that we've been looking at. But if you now think about, you know, producing on target, this entire problem goes away. Exactly what you're saying is like you don't have this pocket of overproduction that you're continuously trying to like mark down and get rid of and turn into like the next buying cycle. You actually just have a very clean and well aligned like system that is running that takes you from season to season. It allows you to play with like not having strict seasons as well, like something that fashion has been known for in the past, but allows you to play with like launching things that are sort of all year round. So with a system like ours, typically what you'd expect, the kind of, let's say positive uplifts that we see very quickly within 6 to 8 weeks is a revenue impact, because essentially the things that you're producing are in the right place at the right time. That's what you'd hope to see, right? A general sell-through improvement. So that idea before that I was talking about, like you have 10 items and then you are only selling 4 or 5. Now you have 10 items and you're selling 8, right? So that's the kind of shift you'd like to see. And that's the kind of results that we're getting. And fundamentally, you have like less unsold inventory. So you don't have to push your brand through like the markdown cycle. Like, have you shopped at those brands that are like permanently on markdown?
Yeah.
Or even those like, we made too much, so we're going to keep kind of dropping our pricing, right? So we see these narratives, and you don't have to go there, because that is a brand further cost, which is like a brand dilution cost, where your customers are just like always waiting for the next sale, right? And that's basically what we help these small brands avoid, the small and medium sized brands, because they are, I think then able to operate with like doing what they do best, right?
Mm.
Which is really like creating a meaningful brand with beautiful products that appeal to their customers. And that's what they can focus on while the system takes care of the end-to-end operations.
Sustainability is often looked at as like it's a good to have and it's a social thing. But what you're saying, what Nool is trying to solve for all of these fashion brands, is also the monetary aspect of it. So sustainability is important because you can also save money by being sustainable
Yes.
as well. I also want to know, in terms of as a future entrepreneur who's curious about being more sustainable, and as we know that there is not enough information about sustainable fashion brands, how is it that one can start with their sense of conscious consumption and conscious curiosity when they enter entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think as an entrepreneur in this journey, what I've learned is that it's not a either or. Like oftentimes sustainability, businesses that want to have a positive climate impact or a positive planet impact are seen as some type of impact businesses. And I think that then just pushes you down a path where, especially like when you're trying to build like business with external capital, it pushes you down a path with fewer options, right? But this journey has taught me that essentially you can build a planet positive business that is actually just really good business sense. I think the VC, that the venture studio that I worked with to sort of come out of for this business idea, they talk about it more like a green discount, right? We need to stop thinking of life as a green premium and more as a green discount, because oftentimes it just requires us to like take a fundamental step back and go, why is this industry or this supply chain or this particular sort of process designed this way? And what would happen if I reimagined it? And I think that's a great, like, that pushed me also to think about, I picked a problem like overproduction from the brand side.
Mm.
There's so many other problems within the fashion space that can sort of, I think that I've seen such interesting, whether it's technology or business model kind of shifts that also allude to this, that like good business is essentially good for the brand, good for the supply chain, and really good for the planet. And it is possible to have these, right? Of course, there's going to be sort of a lot of pushback to that idea, because I think fundamentally we've somehow convinced ourselves as a world that, you know, it is either or. Like you are either doing an impact or you're going to be like wildly successfully profitable, right? But I think you have to kind of really push back against that idea, and then I think it is something where we're going through this. I used agentic AI because I was impressed or sort of almost like intrigued as a modality to reimagine a
Mm.
problem statement. For many people that look at what we're doing, they could go, "Oh, this is the age-old detail inventory problem that we're looking at," and that's true. It is the age-old problem, but there is sort of new technology available today that allows us to make this available to SMEs, which in a very domain specific way that solves this problem in a lot more granular manner than it's ever been done before, right? And so I think there's these opportunities to reimagine traditional problems with new technology, but it could also be, it doesn't necessarily need to be technology from like a software perspective. It could also be hard technology like recycling of, you know, polyester or cotton. Like these are all like spaces that are going through so much transformation recently. And so that's an example of hard tech that we had looked at when we were going through that journey, right? And then I think a last one, unconscious consumption, because this is something that I struggle with as someone in this space, right? I think you want to be really clear about when you're having a transactional relationship with a piece of clothing. I take clothing because we've talked about fashion, but this is true of anything, like
Mm.
whether it's your refrigerator and the food in it, or whether it's, you know, sort of any other physical artifact around you. Clothing is a great example because when we were growing up, I think there was more of an emphasis on care, like repair, reuse, care, even donation used to happen sort of within a known circle. And I think the sheer quantity of things that were going through that were much lesser. So it was very easy to find someone who was, let's say, coming after you in a certain age group or at a certain time and say, hey, would you like to, you know, use this, right? And so all of that felt like it was a lot more under our control. And as a result, I think what we didn't have was we didn't have a very transactional relationship with our clothing. We had a very sort of sentimental, in some cases, or often like a relationship where we were deeply impacted if something tore or something. Today, I think a large part of our closet, we have a very transactional relationship with. It's there for like 4 or 5 uses. We've forgotten that it's even there. There is like a, you know, to a degree, like some people might do that cleanse every couple of months and they put stuff away for recycling. But I don't think they even realize like that it is never being recycled. It's just being dumped somewhere. I don't think our mind even goes that far because it's a system that kind of feels inaccessible. After you've dumped it in the bin, we don't know where it went, right? So, and I think we have to revisit that. Like, I think we have to think about what would drive us. This is the way like fashion is the way that we interact with the world. It's the way that we present ourselves, right? Even when I was like starting in this industry, my husband reminded me that like the importance of fashion, right? Like historically, why have we always adored it? So it is so strange to me that on one end of the spectrum, this epitomizes so many things that we consider beautiful and artistic. And on the other end, there is a visual representation of that in our closet that to us feels like it is so forgettable and so easy to throw away. And I think like that, if we can fix that relationship, whether it's for ourselves in the form of like, I've tried the capsule wardrobe method. I've tried to seek out spaces where I can like consciously, upcycle some items that I have. I had completely kind of lost touch with things like sewing. And now I'm thinking about, how do I learn what I tried to unlearn so consciously because it was just not required, right? And so I think it's a very deeply personal journey, and I wish you luck as you explore this for yourself. But I definitely think that it deserves a sort of deeper reflection on like why are we willing to be so transactional with something that meant so much to us in terms of how we present ourselves to the world.
And that makes so much sense because I'll tell you, in certain cultures, so I'll share the story that happened with me recently. A friend of mine was just going to deliver, and I mean, living in Singapore, like we get these baby registries and everything. So I asked her, I'm like, what's your registry? And she said, look, in our culture, a newborn baby is not supposed to wear anything new. So the ancestral practice of that particular culture is that they wear something which is already pre-worn by another baby previously. So she said that if you know someone who's donating clothes,
Oh wow.
for my child, I would want to do that for the next
Excellent.
3-4 months. And then be it clothes, be it a crib, be it a stroller, every single thing. So there are cultures who ancestrally have inherited the circular economy system where the sense of transaction also represents towards nostalgia.
Yeah.
Right? Like when you're giving your child's clothes that, you also go through that sense of nostalgia path of like, oh, like Mama Bear in like that onesie.
It's like
all of those
enduring,
things.
right? It's the inheriting that I think growing up you probably did from, like your cousins or your parents. Like it's so common, I think it used to be. Used to be. But it's this idea that today it is available to us at a cost point and a convenience factor that allows us to mistreat it, that and I think that's the thing we need to unpack, right? Is how do we make this? Of course, we have to make this profitable and sensible and sort of a growth mindset for an industry. But at the same time, how do we as consumers then interpret that to also be more sustainable and long lasting and something that we can really feel like we don't have to keep forcing circularity, it is inbuilt within the system, right? So in a very linear system today, which is fashion consumption, it is absolutely linear because to be honest, it's not going anywhere once you recycle it. It is not going back to become the next clothing item. How do we, introduce circularity so systemically that you and I don't have to have this conversation about it as an individual consumer? And I think that to your point of conscious design earlier, and we haven't cracked like as no, we did not crack it end to end. We are very focused on one problem, in that true startup mindset of like finding our product market fit in that problem. But my vision for it is so much larger than that one problem that we have set out to solve because it is an industry that would benefit from an end-to-end thought process, right? A more conscious design, as you call it.
Given you're challenging the norms of a multi-trillion dollar industry, what kind of challenges are you experiencing or is Nool experiencing when you reach out to some of these SMEs?
And I think that's a really interesting question because I do think that for a lot of businesses, what we're saying is the way they would want to operate. I think we, often without getting into like the, how does your solution compare to others or how does your solution work, which is maybe the more technical part of that conversation that we have with them. But just on principles, like I think they live among a series of like spreadsheets and systems and nothing that's been truly built for them because I think fashion was always seen as like something so complicated as an industry that people just provide them with generic solutions, right? And so it has been surprisingly easy for us to have that conversation around the first few months we were co-building with our early customers. And we spent a lot of time listening deeply to like how is it that they operate? what is available to them. And so we're a lot more confident, as we say, that having something that is like designed that is specific to fashion and fashion retail particularly, that helps them to, really just manage the day-to-day of what they're doing, has not been a hard sell. I think thinking about how to better align demand and supply, and the old question of like, how do you forecast something that is, so trend driven? That is a challenge. I will say that you can perfectly probably be accurate in a lot of other categories, but in fashion, not so much, because suddenly a trend will come out of nowhere. And then, you don't prepare for it, and the long lead times kind of make you miss out on that opportunity, right? So, like, that is a challenge. That is something we strive to continuously improve. We make a lot of progress, of course, with like the sort of much more traditional machine learning techniques that we have. But even then, you cannot perfectly forecast a world of the future, because then you almost would be, I guess you would be some kind of astrologist. Right? I think you can help them plan a lot better for their contingencies and plan with a more financial mindset as well. And that's what we're enabling them to do.
Thank you so much for sharing, Malini. It's been super interesting to learn more about Noel and the kind of problems that the brand is trying to solve. And I also feel that as a founder, I can sense and hear the sense of passion when you talk about the product, about your clients, about the problem that you're solving, which is something that I truly believe that every single business should strive for as well, because businesses should be used always for good. That there is people, purpose, and profit can come together. It doesn't have to be, as you said, one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. I think that's really what it is. We have to really push ourselves to believe that these coexist harmoniously. Because if we do that and we lead as entrepreneurs, the funding follows, the people follow, and the outcomes will be there. Over time, incentives will be aligned to look at a more balanced way of appreciating a business. I think it's when, and I say this sort of with this lived experience of Node, right? It's when you have these spirited conversations with your customers that you can find like so many points of alignment, that I often wonder, why more of this is not something we hear about. So it's great that you're making space for these conversations. So your podcast as well.
I truly appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for sharing, Malini.